There are many of us who were born with an insatiable desire to know the truth of our history and our potentials. Our guest today, Walter Cruttenden, is one with an extraordinary desire to know the answers to these questions. A walking archaeoastronomy think tank, he's founder of the Binary Research Institute. Walter's done some astounding research. He's the writer-producer of The Great Year, a PBS broadcast documentary film that was narrated by James Earl Jones that explores evidence of astronomical cycles of time known to cultures throughout the ancient world. His book, The Lost Star of Myth and Time, provides evidence for an alternative theory of history based on ancient science encoded in myth and folklore that claims that our solar system revolves around a mysterious companion star in a 24,000-year cycle. As it does, the Earth moves through the electromagnetic field of this binary star that causes subtle changes in consciousness over large periods of time. This vast celestial motion affects all life, and at some stages, the influence is positive and leads to golden ages and an enlightened state, while at others, it can be negative, leading to the collapse of civilization. It's as if at times we are plugged into cosmic energies, while at others we are unplugged. I believe Walter Cruttenden's work connects us with an intelligence that will enable us to consciously plug ourselves into cosmic consciousness and insert ourselves into the divine workings of the cosmos. Are you ready to plug in? Walter, welcome to Dreamland.
Pleasure to be with you, William.
Wow, it's really great to talk with you, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
You bet. I'm sitting here looking over the ocean and looking forward to a good talk.
Yeah, you were kind enough to attend my lecture for Orange County MUFON not long ago, and you mentioned then that you were at one of my earlier lectures, and I have to tell you, Walter, that having had a chance to read Lost Star of Myth and Time and to watch The Great Year, this is a clear-cut case of you just never know who's listening. I mean, to me, your work is leading to some amazing discoveries, and I'm honored to have you as a peer.
Oh, it's a joy. You know, William, since I was a little boy, I've been interested in ancient cultures, and my mom must have bought me 100 books on old cities, you know, from Pompeii to Sumer. And when I got into school and sort of had formal history classes, you know, they taught us that everything's sort of linear, and anything that came before us must be more primitive. And it just didn't jive with a lot of the books that I had been reading that it really indicated many of these ancient civilizations, you know, such as ancient Egypt, were really quite advanced. So that's kind of what got me going on this whole trip.
And that is kind of a sort of a shadow lurking behind the pages of the book, The Lost Star of Myth and Time. Modern man is obsessed with the linear focus, and we view events and discoveries on the basis of evolution, going from simpler to more complex levels. And even church authorities at one time said, this is where history begins, and in order for you to get to heaven, you pay your tax and we'll get you to heaven. But now, many have compounded that belief by saying we are in an end time, and truly, some believe an end of the age appears to be close. It's in the daily news. It's affecting our politics. We're going to war over these concepts. But ancient cultures view time as cyclical. I mean, even the Old Testament speaks of a time and a season for every purpose. And this seems to be, to me, one of the reasons your work is so important, because this linear view, where's it leading us?
Yeah, and, you know, the linear view is only about 150 years old. Really, it began with the work of probably Herbert Spencer and Darwin, who, you know, were really studying biology. And because history was progressing at a rather rapid rate, I should say civilization, since the Dark Ages, it was sort of this biological theory was extrapolated outward to sort of all civilization, and I think that fitted sort of the political agendas of the European countries that, you know, were, say, exploring other lands where they could say those older lands like Egypt were far more primitive. But if you go back in history, say 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years before that, this idea of a great year or a great cycle is the dominant belief throughout many, many cultures. In fact, I think it was Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen in their book Hamlet's Mill that documented over 30 ancient cultures that had this belief in a great year, and they tied it to procession. So if it was just one or two, cultures that believed in this idea, then I might not have been so passionate about looking at sort of alternative histories. But realizing that the former professor of the history of science at MIT is telling us that 30 different cultures, ranging from Nordic to Polynesian to just everything in between, has this belief, it really got me going to look into whether or not it has some substance to it.
The Egyptians and the Sumerians, others have left us texts that say that civilization goes back tens of thousands of years. Was there, Walter, a golden age? And if so, what was the consciousness of the people? What did they know about the cosmos that we don't? And why did these civilizations decline?
Well, the concept of a golden age is, again, universal. It's like the deluge or the flood myth. You find it everywhere throughout ancient cultures, and certainly different cultures had different names for it. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi the first time, and it was clearly a golden age when man could talk with the gods, and the Hopis talked about it being the first world and that sort of thing. And but probably the Indians and the Greeks were most explicit in that they broke this cycle down into very specific, frames. The Greeks called them the Iron, Bronze, Silver, and Golden Age, and Plato tied that again to the precession of the equinox. And the Indians, the Vedic teachings had the same sort of breakdown, although they called it Kali Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Treta Yuga, and Satya Yuga. But the way they describe the ages, it's very similar to the Greeks. The Greeks, said there's the age of man, the age of the hero, the age of the demigod, and the age of the gods. And the Indians talk much the same way, in that in the higher ages, one can freely talk with the gods, and it's almost like physical reality is thinner. So the myth is prevalent around the world, and yes, I believe there really was a golden age, but the science behind it is something we're sort of still on the track here of figuring out.
One of the key areas of your research is the precession of the equinox. Can you give us a primer on the precession? What causes it?
Sure. Yeah, this is something, that these cultures often tied this myth to, and it's simply, if you're looking due east on the equinox, say at sunrise, where the sun's right there, say 4,000 years ago, you would have seen Aries, and 2,000 years ago, really the last 2,000 years ago, Pisces would have been there. And now Pisces is fading from view, and Aquarius is dawning. Thus the term, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. So it's simply the constellation that's where the sun is on the equinox. And it changes over time, and we've probably known about this or had a modern theory for it since Newton, or really Copernicus. He said there's three motions of the Earth. It spins on its axis. It gives us the cycle of night and day, of course, and it goes around the Earth and gives us the cycle of the seasons. But he needed a third motion to explain this precession of the equinox. It was known since ancient times, that there's a little different constellation there. So Copernicus came along and said the Earth must wobble. And then Newton, after that, said, well, gee, if the Earth wobbles, it's got to be because of the influence of the sun, or the sun and the moon, really. So they called it the lunisolar theory. And that's kind of been the general theory for why we see a precession of the equinox. But that theory, to me, just didn't seem to offer any cause why you have a rising and falling of the ages. And so in reading some of the sort of ancient scriptures about this and some of the Indian teachings, I found that there's another idea about what might cause precession, and that is that the whole solar system is moving through space. And so that's some of our thinking on precession.
This is William Henry. We're talking with Walter Cruttenden. We're going to continue with our discussion on this whole idea of our sun and solar system moving through space when we get back from the break. This is William Henry. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Walter Cruttenden. Walter, just before the break, we had introduced this idea that perhaps the precession of the equinox was caused by our sun and solar system moving through space. Can you please elaborate on that?
Yes, that's really been our main area of focus, William, at the Binary Research Institute. Gee, where do I start on this? It's a big subject. But, if the solar system is curving through space, giving us a little different view of the stars from Earth at each equinox, then it would take a fairly significant mass to cause the solar system to move through space. And so therefore this idea of another star arises. And I must say that I didn't invent it. There's hints again in ancient mythology that there's another star that has a relationship with the sun, and also the writings of Sri Yukteswar, a fairly recent Vedic or Sanskrit sage, lived in the 1800s, spoke about this. And when we really started to examine the mechanics of precession, and at the Research Institute here, we hired an astrophysicist, Anthony Leon, and a mathematician, Vince Days, and really dug into this, and we found that the precession of the equinox, it moves about 50 arc seconds per year. That's what astronomers have measured, and they measure it very accurately. But they always measure it relative to stars outside the solar system. They want to take very distant points because, it's just easier to measure something, your rate of speed relative to a fixed point. And the farthest star you use, the easier it is to measure. And so they measure against actually quasars that are outside our galaxy. And so they have the measurement down very carefully. But what they haven't done, and that we did, is measure relative to things inside the solar system. And it's hard to do because everything inside the solar system is moving around. Mm-hmm. But we kind of use some math to measure our motion relative to the moon and Venus, and based on conjunctions and things like that, and found that the Earth does not seem to be wobbling or precessing relative to anything within the solar system. But it is clearly moving 50 arc seconds per year to things outside the solar system. And this was sort of our first bit of real hard evidence that precession is caused by the motion of the whole solar system relative to outside points, rather than just a wobbling of the Earth within the solar system. And we found that this turned out to answer a whole bunch of other scientific questions regarding angular momentum and motions of the moon and things like that. But that's all at the website Binary Research Institute, and it's probably a little technical to get into right here.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that gives us a good overview. Something else I wanted to ask you about, Walter, is in The Lost Star, you talk about the belief of Indian astronomers who said that the sun, with the Earth and other planets, traveled along its set orbital path with this companion star, and as it moved, it would move cyclically, move close to, then away from a point in space referred to as Vishnu Nabi, a supposed magnetic center or grand center. Tell us about this grand center and our relationship to it.
Sure. Well, just the first part of that question, all stars move in elliptical patterns, anything that orbits anything, unless they were absolutely equal masses, and even then you'll often see elliptical orbits. But that's Kepler's law. When we get closer to the sun, we move a little faster. We get farther away, we move a little slower, and so I think the Earth's elliptical orbit is between 91 and 95 million miles. That's our range. So if we are going around another star, and we now know that most stars have companions, it's been estimated that over half the stars we see in the night sky, and I was just looking last night, are a binary or double stars. They have companions that they're gravitationally bound to. And so, it wouldn't be that unusual for our sun to have another star. And so if we do, and we're going around it in this elliptical orbit, that would mean, we're going really on a trillion-mile journey through space, and we would not only go close to the companion star and farther away from it at opposite points in the orbit or the cycle, we would also be brought closer to or farther away from other points in space. And that fits with what some of the Indians have talked about, that it's not so much the other star that we orbit that causes this influence directly on Earth, but a third point in space that we're brought closer to and farther away from in our regular orbit. And yes, they called it Vishnu Nabi, or the Grand Magnetic Center, or the Central Center. There's a lot of sort of folklore about it.
And how does it affect us when we're in alignment or attunement with that center, if you will?
Well, it's said that as we are closer to it and we're going faster when we're near it, according to Kepler's laws, then it affects subtle energies and consciousness. And, it was thought up until 1997 that really other stars don't affect our solar system or Earth. And then I think it was in that year that a nurse was driving home from a Seattle hospital, and her radio flipped from one station to another, and at the same time ham radios were knocked off the air, and some astrophysicists were watching this, and they realized that, this isn't happening during the day. It's not due to a solar flare. And so they figured out that there's a few stars out there that seem to be bombarding us regularly. They affect our ionosphere, our magnetosphere, and we believe consciousness itself over very long periods of time. And so sort of our best analogy for it is based on the work of Valerie Hunt at UCLA. What she did was she was studying electromagnetic effects on individuals, and she took some people and put them in the room, in a special room called the Mu room in the physics department. And this is one of these totally insulated rooms where that they use to make very sensitive electronic circuits. So it takes out all the natural EM that's in the air that's going through us right this very minute. And when she put them in there and she was giving them some tests to do, not only did they perform poorly on the tests, but after a prolonged period of time, people just became sad, and a few of them cried, and they were moody and irritable and just wanted to get out of the darn room. And when she reversed it and actually jacked up they could receive the full EM, and she put in some negative ions and things, people were happy and did better on the test and that sort of thing. And we're not 100% sure that that's how this other star might affect Earth, but it's a good analogy, and it does show that subtle energies, things we cannot see, not only affect plant life and growth here on the Earth, but it also can affect our consciousness, our mood. And so we think that that's what might be happening over this very long period of time, one precession equinox, roughly 24,000 years.
Walter, are you familiar with the research presented by David Wilcock and Richard C. Hoagland, research done in Russia that says that they've found evidence that all of the planets in our solar system are showing signs of energetic increase, that in fact we may be entering a zone of frequency that is quote-unquote higher than other regions of the galaxy?
I did read something about that, and Richard's going to be at our conference this October at UCI, the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. Mm-hmm. So I plan to meet with him the day before, and we're going to dig into that a little bit. But I've not studied it enough to really understand it, other than looked at the data where it does seem to be a little more energy affecting not just Earth, but the entire solar system.
And in the book, in The Lost Star of Myth and Time, you talk about a subject that's been familiar to many Dreamland listeners, the idea of Nibiru. Zecharia Sitchin has proposed that this difficult-to-detect planet, or whatever it is, was involved in a celestial cataclysm with another Earth-like planet in our solar system. And he says that after this cataclysm, Earth was formed, kind of hinting that there are two Earths. And when we get back from the break, Walter, I wanted to ask you, how does this possibility of two Earths play into your idea, the binary star hypothesis, which says there are two suns? This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Walter Cruttenden. Walter, just before the break, I asked you the question about Nibiru, and I guess what I'm really asking is, what is your best guess, or what does your research reveal as to the identity of the binary star?
Oh boy, there's really two tracks going on there, William. One is sort of just traditional astrophysics. If we're going around another star and we're not aware of it, then it must be something we can't see, such as a brown dwarf, red dwarf towards the galactic center, where there's a lot of noise, difficult to detect, or maybe even a black hole or some planet-like mass, some form of dark matter that we might not easily detect. But on the other hand, our instruments are getting better and better, and you would think that if there is a nearby brown dwarf, we would have seen it by now. And so that is one area, and we've done the calculations, how far away would it be to be able to get around it in one precession cycle, 24,000 years, etc. And so we have some coordinates there, and we've got people working on it, and we've started some prizes, Galileo Awards, to get people to investigate it. But there's a whole another scenario, too, and that says that gravity might work a little bit differently outside the solar system. It does. And there's some evidence for this. For example, when we look at other galaxies, there's not enough mass to hold these galaxies in their spiral form. The outer stars on these galaxies should have all flown off and the universe be sort of homogeneous by now. And so scientists have invented the term dark matter to say, well, gee, there must be a lot of stuff in there that we can't see. But there's another idea that perhaps on a larger scale that the dynamics are modified a little bit. It's called modified Newtonian dynamics, or MOND. And so just like in quantum physics, things don't quite the way they do in the big world. Some think that maybe our solar system is going faster through space than we perceive it is, and therefore going around a nearby visible star. And I like this scenario because there's some great new evidence out that the solar system is going a lot faster than we think it is. And this is the best paper I've seen is by Reg Cahill. He's down at Flinders University in Australia. And, people have long thought the solar system was moving about 8 kilometers a second, and then I think it's been bumped to 60 or 70 kilometers a second since then. And he's measured next to versus the cosmic microwave background. You see, it's really hard to measure because, we've never actually been to anything else outside the solar system. But relative to CMB, we're actually going 430 to 450 kilometers a second. And that gives you enough speed to actually get around several of the nearby stars. So it's going pretty good.
Yeah. Walter, numerous researchers promote this idea that technologically advanced civilizations existed in the past, and they often attach the idea that the beings who founded those civilizations came from the stars. Have you found any connection to the star beings in your research into the binary star? I guess what I'm asking is, if our sun is part of a binary star system, how would the ancients have known about it if it weren't visible? Did they receive this knowledge from the outside of our solar system, or perhaps did they have a means of altering their consciousness to visualize it?
Yeah, this dark star concept is sort of just one theory, and it's trying to fit the theory of a dual star into just what we know about astrophysics right now. But the other theory is that it could be a visible star, and so, William, I really lean towards the Sirius scenario, that the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, which is only about 8 light years away, is the companion, and there's a lot of evidence for that. If from mythology you go back to the Egyptian iconography, where you have Isis, who represents the star Sirius in ancient Egypt, and she always has this close relationship with Horus. When Horus is a baby, she's suckling Horus, and when Horus is a man, she's holding him or seeming to move him. And Horus, of course, has this big sun on his head because he is an aspect of the sun. So I think the ancient Egyptians knew about this relationship between our sun, our solar system, and Sirius. And there's some fellows in Canada, the Homans, Uwe and Karl-Heinz Homan, who I had the pleasure of visiting a few years ago, and they've been doing transit readings of Sirius for about 20 years. And they just have this fixed telescope that's in their basement pointing out a window, and it's been that way. It's got dust on it and everything, and but it's right there where Sirius is. So when the Earth spins each day, you can see Sirius, and few people realize Sirius is a star you see in the day or night. It's that bright. But you have to know where to look during the day, of course. And they time it, and they've found that there is a gravitational relationship between our solar system and Sirius. And so I lean towards that scenario. And one more point on that, William, you mentioned Nibiru. I've read tons about it, and there's a lot of writings long before Sitchin, from Heiser and Spicer and some of the old Germans who were interpreting some of the in tablets, and most of them say Sirius is the brightest object in the sky. It's the star that is the turning point or the crossing. Mm-hmm. It is, and most of these guys happen to think. And indeed, if Sirius is our companion, then it would be the cause of the movement of the stars across the heaven. It would be the star that our solar system swings around, and so, in 24,000 years, it means we'd get a little different view of the stars every year. And that's
Walter,
the definition.
Christianity is based on the solar or sun myth of a dying and returning sun, S-U-N or S-O-N, take your pick. A mind-boggling discovery was made in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They note that there is not one Messiah or sun/star, but two sons, messiahs, sons, or stars. One is a lay Messiah, the other is a priestly Messiah. What are your thoughts on the possibility that the Dead Sea Scrolls encode this knowledge about a binary star system?
That's an interesting thought. I've not read the scrolls or heard really much about that. And this whole philosophical idea that the gods are stars, the stars are gods, it's hard to understand, especially at this relatively low age we're in right now. But there might be a lot more truth to it than we think it is. But frankly, William, I just don't know too much about that. I do know that the last pagan culture before Christianity, Mithraism, and the Mithraics, they left a fair amount of temples in sort of the whole Roman Greco region. They have this iconography in many of these underground temples that shows a large zodiac, sort of, which is what the sun moves through in one precession equinox. That's how they measure it. It's like the clock of the ages. And they have their god Mithras, and Mithras means a sun outside the sun, or the greater sun. And so they too seem to be talking about this relationship between our sun and another sun. And I've that Mithraism sort of served as a template for Christianity, and that many of the old Mithraic sites were eventually converted to churches.
That's right, yeah. Mithraism was the primary competitor to Christianity in the Roman world, and it would be interesting to see how that all could have possibly been encoded in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because like so much of
iconography, their iconography, in this, besides this zodiac with the sun Mithras, they also have these two boys on either side of it, and you see in these bas-reliefs, one is Cautis holding the torch up, one is Cautapates holding the torch down. And the best take now is that they represent a rising age of light, and a declining age, or an age where the light is going out, holding the torch down. And so it seems that they were not only tuned into this whole idea that precession might be another star, but as you indeed go around this other star, or Mithras, you have this age of light and age of darkness. And I'd love to match that against the scrolls sometime.
Why do you suppose there is resistance to this idea of the binary star hypothesis? You do the Google searches on Walter Cruttenden and the lost star of myth and time, and you get, unfortunately, from scientists, you get these sort of boilerplate responses. Oh, he's just trying to promote himself. There's no peer review on this. The responses they have to this hypothesis, they could make about anything. So how are you planning to sort of get the scientific community on board with this hypothesis?
Well, it's going to take more evidence. We have about 6 arguments right now from, the angular momentum idea to the lunar-solar equations, to the motion of the Earth relative to things within the solar system versus outside the solar system. But I do it to promote myself or to sell books or anything. Remember, I was long retired before I kind of got into this thing. But I think it's useful scientific information. If history is being affected by something, I'd like to know it and know what it is. Also, it's good to know just from a hard science point of view if our solar system is part of a binary system. And I think some of the evidence might actually come from some of the satellites that are out there right now. For example, there's one called Gravity Probe B. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but Stanford and JPL are behind this. They spent about $800 million. It's been going in a polar orbit, and it has the finest gyros ever made by mankind in there. And they're really looking for evidence of general relativity, that the mass of the Earth might be changing space-time. And the early indications are that they're getting some really goofy readings. And I think it's because they're going to realize that precession, one of the things they have to look for when they look at GR, is it works differently than they thought it was. So I think the evidence is building, William, and it probably is less than 5 years away, based on the scope of our technology nowadays.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Walter Cruttenden, author of Lost Star of Myth and Time. Walter, I'd like to share a story with you about Jesus and get your take on it based on your research. In the book of John, Jesus meets up with a blind man who was blind from birth. Jesus spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva and smeared the clay on the man's eyes and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." So he washed and came back able to see. In his book, The Wars of the Jews, Flavius Josephus, the Jewish priest, tells us the location of Siloam had that fountain of sweet and abundant water. The pool of Siloam, which is the same as Shiloh, it means peace, was built near the ancient community that was built around the serpent stone called Zeholeth. This is the only time this tower is mentioned. It must be significant, even though it's the only time that it's mentioned. What are your thoughts on a story like that as you view a story like that through the lens of your research?
Well, a lot of things that happen now were clearly impossible 100 years ago and would have been called miracles, televisions, heart surgeries. Heck, we all carry around little cell phones now and can instantly talk to somebody on the other side of the earth. That would have been just unheard of. And so imagine what things might be like in the higher ages or to people that have a higher age consciousness. And I think Jesus Christ was, definitely an avatar, a great, great soul that, they come to earth to help the rest of us. And so I think that there's things out there that we don't really have any idea of, but we can't conceive of when we're still in a fairly low age. We've just come out of what the Indians would call the Kali Yuga, the age when mankind is only aware of his body and what he can sense through the five senses and, sort of the hard physical world out there. And he thinks he's just a physical being. And supposedly in this age we've just come into, or just coming into, mankind becomes aware that everything is energy and that he is energy. And, there's much greater possibilities. Indeed, if technology is a proxy for the change in consciousness, then the change in consciousness is happening big time. And so I think maybe our astrophysicists or quantum physicists are sort of leading the way in the realization that everything is much greater than just this physical realm. So I tend to believe some of these stories about the higher ages or people with higher age consciousness. But I don't know that we have the full capability to understand them at this point in time.
Yeah, the reason I asked you the question about Jesus bathing the man in the sweet waters is because isn't that one of the terms that the ancients used in reference to the Pleiades, and it's also perhaps a term used for these, let's call them higher vibrational energies, this electromagnetic field that our sun and solar system appears to enter from time to time?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's in the book of Job. There's a saying about, canst thou loosen the bands of Orion, or something about the sweet influence of the Pleiades.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some that are saying that is where this grand magnetic center is, and then when you're close to it, you get this sweet influence. And when you're away from it, we're in the darker ages. And there's a star there in the Pleiades, Alcyone, and there's some myth and folklore that in the Alcyone days, the halcyon days, things were beautiful and golden, and they're not so great when you're away from the halcyon days.
So the time of Jesus, they were away from those better days, right? So what I get from this story is it sounds like they may have had call it a technology they referred to as a tower that was set up that could have been some form of an antenna for these energies that caused miracles to be produced. What are your thoughts on a suggestion such as that?
I wouldn't doubt that older cultures, ancient cultures, still had some of the vestiges of the high technology from prior high cycles. And although, as we were falling into the dark ages and people's mindset and consciousness changed, probably much of this stuff was sort of skirted away or, destroyed in many cases. But yeah, there's a lot of references to that. Somebody had just called my attention the other day to something in the Old Testament that the prophets used to tell the future, and it's called, if I hope I'm saying this right, Urim and Thummim.
Urim and Thummim, right? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Nobody's quite sure what it is. Was it stones that they put in the vest? But the way they talk about it, it's not like it's a physical object.
Right.
But it was used to clearly tell the future.
Yeah.
So who knows?
It makes me think that there was this continuous transmission of knowledge about these ages, but most importantly, or maybe equally importantly, is this notion that there are certain sectors of space that radiate a particular energy, whether it's the Pleiades or Sirius. These folks seem to have had an ability to harvest that energy. In the book, you talk about the incredible research of Philip Callahan and how these towers are built throughout Ireland, these famous round towers that seem to match this kind of idea of a serpent stone mentioned in that story about Jesus. And let's talk about that for a moment, if you wouldn't mind, about how they used these towers, how the Druids used these towers in Ireland.
Well, it goes back to this idea of if we were in higher ages, where's the evidence and that sort of thing. So we tend to look at things just through our own little present eyes, our present paradigm, and we're looking for color television sets or cell phones or computers. Mm-hmm. But if people were really conscious of themselves as energy or consciousness or something much higher than a physical body, they might not have been relying as much on just physical gadgets. They could have been tuned into the whole earth as a instrument, so to speak. And so you find many of these structures, these megalithic structures, cairns, dolmens, obelisks, pyramids, henges, they all seem to be oriented, at least before the year about 1500 BC, towards the cardinal points or celestial points. And then after that, tombs and other stone structures, they kind of become haphazard. And then Callahan's work, he's found, that most stones have a slightly magnetic quality to them. You can find the poles on them, the north or south. And he's found that many of these, the round towers in Ireland, that were actually built by Christians during the Dark Ages, but they were built on sites that went back much older to, probably Druid sites, or even before that. That the towers not only have some very interesting qualities where crops grow better around them and that sort of thing, but the shape of the where these round towers are, when you look at them on a map, it forms the general outline of the stars, the major constellations in the northern hemisphere. It's just amazing the technology, the consciousness these people had, and we've kind of lost so much of that.
Yeah, and speaking of technology and consciousness, we've just got a few minutes left, Walter, but we live during a time when 4 technologies are converging: genes, bits, neurons, and atoms, and it won't be long before these 4 technologies, which are really mythic and almost godlike, it won't be long before they go out of control and are turned on the human body, and we begin to transform ourselves. And the notion is that once this technology passes a certain threshold, roughly that described by sci-fi author Vernor Vinge as singularity, that human beings will potentially enjoy the kinds of powers and pleasures traditionally assigned to gods of the Golden Age. Limitless lifespans, if not immortality, superhuman powers, virtually limitless wealth, fleshly pleasures on demand. Can we fake the Golden Age?
That is a great question, William. I think you need the consciousness to go with it. You can take a miserable person and put them in paradise, and they don't have paradise. And you can take a saint or a sage or a very beautiful and happy person, and you can put them in a prison, and they have paradise. Mm-hmm. I think you're right. We have the power. We're right on the verge in this early Dwapara Yuga where we're figuring stuff out. It's made of all these little tiny pieces. But I don't know how many really have the consciousness yet.
Yeah, you get the sense that as we start augmenting our body by hanging cell phones off our ears and iPods on our shoulders, that, hey, wait a minute, this could be a trap. This could be taking away the spiritual essence of ourselves, and that's something that I think we're going to have to talk about in an upcoming interview. In the moments we have left, could you please tell us about your CPAC conference?
Yes, many of these ideas, there's people that are far more knowledgeable about them than I am that will be appearing at CPAC, the Conference on Procession and Ancient Knowledge, this October 13th, 14th, 15th at UCI. And, for example, John Daring, he's this scientist with SARA, Scientific Applications Research Association, who's got a wonderful model for how this higher age effect might work. And he really is a great speaker, humorous, and he'll be there. Jeff Marcy, who's head of astronomy at UC Berkeley, and the number one exosolar planet hunter. He's found more planets around other stars than anybody else. He'll be there talking about the astrobiology and the possibility of life on other planets. And so, yeah, it's going to be fun. Anybody that's interested can just go to CPAK online. That's cpaconline.com and sign up. It's going to be a fun event.
As I understand, you've got Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, John Major Jenkins, Richard C. Hoagland. Wow, what a lineup.
Yeah,
Incredible.
Robert Chalk's going to be there, too. It's fun. We really have a ball. Our first day, we just kind of have a little private session, and then the next few days are for the public.
Walter, we've come to the end of our time for today, but thank you so much for taking time out to speak with us. I really appreciate it.
You bet, William.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
You're about to experience something you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe, reporting on the absolute leading edge of science, discovery, and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss our website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on changes in the permafrost in Alaska and Siberia that are happening much, much faster than anybody anticipated. Hold on to your hats, folks, or should that be boats. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. As we begin September 2006, there is disturbing news about Earth's environment. A rapidly spreading fungal disease is predicted to wipe out about half the world's frogs, toads, newts, and salamanders by the end of this year. Andrew Blaustein, a zoology professor at Oregon State University, says, quote, species are going extinct very fast. These are bioindicators that something is wrong with the planet, unquote. Severe drought has been affecting the world's largest rainforest in the Amazon of Brazil for the second year. Some scientists warn that, quote, global warming and deforestation are pushing the entire enormous area toward a tipping point where the rainforest could start to die, unquote. Tree and plant deaths in the Amazon rainforest could release huge volumes of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, making greenhouse warming even worse. The last 2 days of August, hundreds of dead seabirds known as shearwaters washed up on the beaches of Nuna, Alaska Island, southwest of Fairbanks, between the Bering Sea and Pacific Ocean. Even more dramatically, several hundred shearwaters fell dying or dead onto a crabbing boat in Nuna, Alaska Bay. Seabird specialist Art Souls from the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge told authorities that shearwaters can move in flocks of more than 1 million birds at a time. And he wondered if the seabirds might be suffering from starvation. A few of the dead birds are undergoing necropsies, and Art Souls told me this week he hopes to have lab results back by mid-September. If the answer is starvation, could it be related to the rapidly warming Arctic climate that is causing permafrost to melt and forcing animals in their ecosystems to keep moving north in order to find familiar food sources? And now this week, in the September 7th issue of the journal Nature, scientists from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks published data that shows the Arctic permafrost, especially in Siberia, is melting faster and releasing 5 times more methane than originally calculated. Methane is another greenhouse gas, but can trap heat 23 times more powerfully than carbon dioxide because methane absorbs solar radiation in a different spectrum than CO2. Now, what exactly is permafrost? When the last ice age glaciers were around, some 20,000 years ago and before, dust and organic material got blown around on the soil in Siberia and Arctic tundra. The dust and organic material built up to at least 80 feet thick, where it has been frozen ever since, until this new modern era of global warming. As the Earth warms up, the permafrost soils begin to melt, and then they become wet with water. Microbes start to eat the carbon-rich organic material and use up oxygen as they consume the carbon. The result is that the carbon in the watery permafrost gets converted to methane, which is CH4. That's one carbon molecule and 4 hydrogen molecules. That methane gas from all the carbon-digesting microbes bubbles up through melted water, up through the surface of the permafrost and into the Earth's atmosphere. The warmer the Earth gets, the faster the permafrost melts, the more methane is added to the atmosphere, the thicker the methane and carbon dioxide blanket around the Earth becomes, which heats up Earth even more. Scientists call this a positive feedback cycle, and methane could threaten the world's future climate even more by accelerating global heating. One atmospheric scientist who spent 12 years studying global warming computer models at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California is now a staff scientist at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology in Stanford University. He is Ken Caldera, PhD. This week, he explained that the Earth's permafrost is supposed to have at least 900 billion tons of methane. That's 150 tons for every man, woman, and child in the 6.5 billion people on our planet now. The fact that the Ice Age soils are suddenly melting in more volume and speed than anyone ever expected disturbs Dr. Caldera greatly.
This frozen ground is 80 feet thick on average in Siberia. So if we heat the planet to a certain extent, it's like we have a fuse burning down into this permafrost, releasing methane as it goes. And so what we're doing over the next decades potentially could push us past some kind of tipping point that would result in release of all the methane or most of the methane in permafrost soil.
Is there any computer simulation of what would happen to surface life if all the methane were released?
We've done simulations, not explicitly including the methane from these wetlands, but just looking at what happens if you burn a large chunk of the fossil fuels that are available. And we get temperature increases in the Arctic region of 20 degrees Celsius. I'm trying to convert that quickly into Fahrenheit. It's something like 35 degrees Fahrenheit warming in the Arctic. And if you get that kind of warming, definitely the methane will go. You know, we're looking at a kind of planet that hasn't existed for 50 million years.
Going back to the dinosaurs, really.
Yeah, or maybe this period shortly after the dinosaurs. But what we're doing to our planet is unusual, even when viewed from a geologic perspective. For example, the current data suggests that the Earth has never had more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than now for at least 20 or 25 million years, and possibly 50 million years. The other thing is that both carbon dioxide and the methane, after it converts the carbon dioxide, dissolves into the ocean. And carbon dioxide, when it dissolves in seawater, makes the ocean more acidic and can prevent marine organisms from building their shells and skeletons. And so we're looking at a wide array of, environmental catastrophes that we barely understand.
And are really coming upon us quickly.
Yeah, I think the sense of urgency, Walter and her coworkers did a very thorough job of sampling the methane bubbles that were coming up through these lakes that form in the permafrost. And they would put little devices to catch the bubble and measure the amount of methane coming out. And they did a sampling technique where they had some of these bubble catchers distributed randomly and some of them distributed over hot spots where they saw bubbles coming out vigorously. And by having this random sampling component, they could make better extrapolations from their measurements to what the average methane release was over the lakes. And then they were able to use satellite photographs to understand how the size of the lakes have been growing over time. So the main advance that gave them the higher estimate was really a more thorough and careful set of measurements of the methane bubbling out of the water.
How surprised are you and other scientists that you know that with this more thorough measurement that it is now clear that 5 times the amount of methane is being released?
I look at this as a disturbing early harbinger that maybe things might be worse than our models predict. This is coming up repeatedly, that there were models of how much sea ice should melt back as a result of global warming, and the satellite observations show that sea ice is actually in the Arctic is melting back much faster than previously assumed. And there's other evidence Greenland is melting faster than a lot of models predicted. And here we have observations suggest the permafrost is melting and releasing its methane faster than we had thought. And so there's a whole series of observations where things are looking worse than had been anticipated before. And so, it's getting to the point where finding out that things are worse than you thought is no longer surprising. There seems to be a general trend of results that suggest that the earlier ideas about what the effects would be of global warming have turned out to be rather optimistic.
And if the methane feedback begins to accelerate because of global warming, what is the worst case for surface life with this much methane being added to the blanket around the Earth?
If current emission trends continue, the temperature bands, you can think of it when the Earth warms as bands of climate or temperature moving towards poles. And already those bands are moving 10 to 20 feet per day on average. And under middle-of-the-road kind of emission scenarios, those bands start moving 30 feet per day towards the poles. Maybe it'll end up being 40 or 45 feet a day that ecosystems need to move to keep up with their climate zones. And it's obvious that oak trees and other sedentary organisms can't move that fast to keep up with climate change. And so what will happen is that organisms will die off in climate zones that they're no longer adapted to. And invasive species will come in and occupy those ecological niches. And so I think what we'll see is a replacement of the kind of complex life that has developed over many millennia and millions of years and be replaced with a much weedier world. I think the future will be a great place for weeds, and we'll see a much weedier world. People say, hasn't climate changed in the past? If you look at the change from the glacial time to after the Ice Age ended, that climate is now changing about 100 times faster than it changed during the end of the glacial time. The carbon dioxide is changing 100 times faster than it did at the end of the Ice Ages. My perspective is that industrial society has so overwhelmed natural emissions that we're far outside of the capacity of the natural system to keep up with the rate of change that we're asking the Earth to undergo.
And does that mean that the numbers of extinctions will be even greater than has been projected?
Yeah, I said before that the ecosystems will have to move towards the poles at 30 feet a day in order to keep up with the climate change. So that's hard enough to do if you have a complete band of natural vegetation going from the equator to the pole. But in real life, that vegetation has to cross roads and farmers' fields and cities and towns and then jump to some other place where it could possibly be adapted to the new climate. And take the oak tree, it has this big acorn and depends on a squirrel to run and bury that acorn somewhere. And so maybe that if that lifetime of the oak tree is 50 years and that squirrel could run a few hundred feet with it, it could maybe move a few hundred feet in 50 years. But that's why I think what we're likely to see in the future is a world of weeds, where weeds replace the kind of complex ecosystems that are more common today.
Is there anything that could be done now that could stop this tipping point in the increasing methane release?
Okay, I think there are two basic strategies. And the first strategy involves diminishing greatly carbon dioxide emissions, which requires the transformation of our energy system. The other possibility that has been discussed, although nobody has really published detailed calculations about it, is that it might be possible to inject aerosols in the stratosphere to block some sunlight, engineer our climate to prevent additional Arctic warming or even to cool the Arctic. It's one thing adding carbon dioxide to the system and inadvertently changing climate. The politics and ethics and wisdom of purposefully engineering our climate is a far more dubious matter. But it looks like it would be within our technical capability to engineer our climate directly. And the question is, do we have the wisdom to actually do that without creating even bigger problems?
And if we don't do either, what is the worst case for the future with methane building up?
Well, nobody can really predict the future, but, I think that, to me, it looks like we're pushing our planet into territory where it hasn't been for many tens of millions of years. And when you give the planet that hard a knock, I don't think anybody can accurately predict what is going to happen.
One of the most surprising facts that I learned from Dr. Caldera is that neither of the atmospheric computer models at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, or the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in Livermore, California, ever included methane emissions in their atmospheric calculations. That is changing now. In addition to cutting down greenhouse emissions and Dr. Caldera's proposals to artificially control solar radiation on Earth by putting photon-reflecting aerosols in the atmosphere, this week, former astronaut and U.S. Senator from New Mexico, Harrison Schmitt, told lawyers at an Albuquerque Bar Association meeting that we need quickly to get back to the moon to ensure humanity's future and energy future. He explained that in the dust on the moon is an element called helium-3. There's enough helium-3 on the moon to feed little sun-like fusion reactors on Earth for the foreseeable future. Senator Schmitt says there is already a political context that would allow mining helium-3 for a global energy system. That is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 between the United States and the Soviet Union. That treaty prohibited nuclear weapons or military bases on the moon. It also prohibits any nation from claiming the moon or other celestial bodies as territory. But that 1967 treaty would not prohibit a private company from going to the moon to mine helium-3 or other resources. Competition for lunar minerals will soon begin as nations such as Japan, China, India, Russia, and the United States all plan to be back on the moon in this coming decade. Meanwhile, in another 10 years, how much of the Amazon forest will have died or been cleared away, releasing tons of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere? How much permafrost will have melted, releasing tons of methane into the Earth's atmosphere? How much warmer will the Earth be in 10 years? How ferocious will the storms be? And how many species will be forever gone from the air, the water, and the lands of our planet? Whitley, for me personally as a reporter, reporting about environmental issues now for nearly 30 years, I found this interview with Dr. Caldera to be one of the most sobering that I personally have ever experienced.
Well, Linda, I did too. I'm sitting here in shock because of the fact that, quite frankly, what he talked about this, what's going on now being so very much more intense than what happened at the end of the last ice age. We wrote Superstorm based on what happened at the end of the last ice age. The climactic upheavals then were absolutely horrendous. beyond anything we have ever seen. And I just have a feeling that this planet is this species is sitting on a stick of hydrogen-powered dynamite, and the fuse is burning fast. This is a great shocker. It's the most shocking report I think you've ever done.
Well, and I felt the same thing when I read that headline from the Nature journal. That is one of the single most respected scientific journals on the earth. And for this data to come out this week saying that by 5 times the permafrost is releasing methane 5 times more rapidly and in greater volume than ever calculated before, and we know that the Greenland is melting faster. We know that the Arctic is melting faster. And if methane is going to be accelerating into the atmosphere at the rates that they're now trying to calculate, and to realize that scientists had not even been putting methane into the CO2 greenhouse blanket calculation the way it now needs to be added. And that means, Whitley, that the figures about the warming of this planet are going to have to go up. And we're already facing a conservative estimate, the most conservative, of an increase in average global Earth temperature of at least 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 90 years. That's 3 to 4 times the amount of increase in the last century. And if you start adding methane at the level that this new permafrost study indicates, and if that number has to start climbing, and it starts going toward the 10 degrees Fahrenheit that has been the outside warming in the next 90 years, can you imagine what this Earth would be like over the next 9 decades if we actually are going to have average global warming that reaches 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century?
Linda, it means megadeath. It means it's the end game. That is the death of billions on this planet. It's by starvation, by lack of water, by flooding, by storms, you name it. The United States is not exempt. No part of the world is exempt, Linda. And Linda, I have to tell you that we have to pray. And we're starting a new kind of a group on our website, a meditation group, which hopefully will be able to do something that is kind of outside of the envelope, because inside the envelope we have not just a completely inert United States government, but governments all over the world refusing to really do anything, and the Kyoto protocols failing on 2 levels because of a lack of cooperation even among the signatories and the fudging, I guess it would be the best way to put it, of the protocols, and the discovery that the protocols themselves may actually contribute to global warming and more greenhouse gases by the planting of trees. We're in trouble. And this is something we all have to face squarely. Some of us are going to make it, and some of us aren't. I mean, this is going to happen.
And we need also to pray for the animals and the plants, because, Whitley, the rate of extinction now is almost really beyond comprehension.
The rate of extinction is higher, folks, than it was when the dinosaurs died out. Think of that. It's worse now than it was then. It's hard to believe, but that is the case. Worse than it was up until the very climax in the last 100 or so years of the dieback, when it was indeed much worse than it is now. It can get worse, thank God. We're not that far along yet. Another thing that must be remembered is, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it isn't even expensive. All it takes is leadership. A president of the United States willing to stand up and lead us in this area could still turn the thing around. Even now, even after all of these years of the Bushes and the Clintons, all the way back through the Reagans, the Nixons. We knew this problem clearly back during the Reagan years, and we have done nothing. No president has ever stepped forward, really. So, hopefully the next one will.
European countries that, were, say, exploring other lands where they could say those older lands like Egypt were far more primitive. But if you go back in history, say 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years before that, this idea of a great year or a great cycle is the dominant belief throughout many, many cultures. In fact, I think it was Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen in their book Hamlet's Mill that documented over 30 ancient cultures that had this belief in a great year, and they tied it to precession. So if it was just one or two, cultures that believed in this idea, then I might not have been so passionate about looking at sort of alternative histories. But realizing that the former professor of the history of science at MIT is telling us that 30 different cultures, ranging from Nordic to Polynesian to just everything in between, has this belief. It really got me going to look into whether or not it has some substance to it.
The Egyptians and the Sumerians, others have left us texts that say that civilization goes back tens of thousands of years. Was there, Walter, a golden age? And if so, what was the consciousness of the people? What did they know about the cosmos that we don't? And why did these civilizations decline?
Well, the concept of a golden age is, again, universal. It's like the deluge or the flood myth. You find it everywhere throughout ancient cultures, and certainly different cultures had different names for it. The Egyptians called it Zep-Tepi the first time, and it was clearly a golden age when man could talk with the gods, and the Hopis talked about it being the first world and that sort of thing. And but probably the Indians and the Greeks were most explicit in that they broke this cycle down into very specific frames. The Greeks called them the Iron, Bronze, Silver, and Golden Age, and Plato tied that again to the precession of the equinox. And the Indians, the Vedic teachings had the same sort of breakdown, although they called it Kali Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Treta Yuga, and Satya Yuga. But the way they describe the ages, it's very similar to the Greeks. The Greeks, said there's the age of man, the age of the hero, the age of the demigod, and the age of the gods. And the Indians talked much the same way, in that in the higher ages, one can freely talk with the gods, and it's almost like physical reality is thinner. So the myth is prevalent around the world, and yes, I believe there really was a golden age, but the science behind it is something we're sort of still on the track here of figuring out.
One of the key areas of your research is the precession of the equinox. Can you give us a primer on the precession? What causes it?
Sure. Yeah, this is something, that these cultures often tied this myth to, and it's simply, if you're looking due east on the equinox, say at sunrise, where the sun's right there, say 4,000 years ago, you would have seen Aries, and 2,000 years ago, really the last 2,000 years ago, Pisces would have been there. And now Pisces is fading from view, and Aquarius is dawning. Thus the term, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. So it's simply the constellation that's where the sun is on the equinox. And it changes over time. And we've probably known about this or had a modern theory for it since Newton, or really Copernicus. He said there's three motions of the Earth. It spins on its axis. It gives us the cycle of night and day, of course, and it goes around the Earth and gives us the cycle of the seasons. But he needed a third motion to explain this precession of the equinox. It was known since ancient times, that there's a little different constellation there. So Copernicus came along and said the Earth must wobble. And then Newton, after that, said, well, gee, if the Earth wobbles, it's got to be because of the influence of the sun or the sun and the moon, really. So they called it the lunisolar theory. And that's kind of been the general theory for why we see a precession of the equinox. But that theory, to me, just didn't seem to offer any cause why you have a rising and falling of the ages. And so in reading some of the sort of ancient scriptures about this and some of the Indian teachings, I found that there's another idea about what might cause precession, and that is that the whole solar system is moving through space. And so that's some of our thinking on precession.
This is William Henry. We're talking with Walter Cruttenden. We're going to continue with our discussion on this whole idea of our sun and solar system moving through space when we get back from the break. There are many of us who were born with an insatiable desire to know the truth of our history and our potentials. Our guest today, Walter Cruttenden, is one with an extraordinary desire to know the answers to these questions. A walking archaeoastronomy think tank, he's founder of the Binary Research Institute. Walter's done some astounding research. He's the writer-producer of The Great Year, a PBS broadcast documentary film that was narrated by James Earl Jones that explores evidence of astronomical cycles of time known to cultures throughout the ancient world. His book, The Lost Star of Myth and Time, provides evidence for an alternative theory of history based on ancient science encoded in myth and folklore that claims that our solar system revolves around a mysterious companion star in a 24,000-year cycle. As it does, the Earth moves through the electromagnetic field of this binary star that causes subtle changes in consciousness over large periods of time. This vast celestial motion affects all life, and at some stages, the influence is positive and leads to golden ages and an enlightened state, while at others, it can be negative, leading to the collapse of civilization. It's as if at times we are plugged into cosmic energies, while at others we are unplugged. I believe Walter Cruttenden's work connects us with an intelligence that will enable us to consciously plug ourselves into cosmic consciousness and insert ourselves into the divine workings of the cosmos. Are you ready to plug in? Walter, welcome to Dreamland.
Pleasure to be with you, William.
Wow, it's really great to talk with you, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
You bet. I'm sitting here looking over the ocean and looking forward to a good talk.
Yeah, you were kind enough to attend my lecture for Orange County MUFON not long ago, and you mentioned then that you were at one of my earlier lectures, and I have to tell you, Walter, that having had a chance to read Lost Star of Myth and Time and to watch The Great Year, this is a clear-cut case of you just never know who's listening. I mean, to me, your work is leading to some amazing discoveries, and I'm honored to have you as a peer.
Oh, it's a joy. You know, William, since I was a little boy, I've been interested in ancient cultures, and my mom must have bought me 100 books on old cities, you know, from Pompeii to Sumer. And when I got into school and sort of had formal history classes, you know, they taught us that everything's sort of linear, and anything that came before us must be more primitive. And it just didn't jive with a lot of the books that I had been reading that it really indicated many of these ancient civilizations, you know, such as ancient Egypt, were really quite advanced. So that's kind of what got me going on this whole trip.
And that is kind of a sort of a shadow lurking behind the pages of the book, The Lost Star of Myth and Time. Modern man is obsessed with the linear focus, and we view events and discoveries on the basis of evolution, going from simpler to more complex levels. And even church authorities at one time said, this is where history begins, and in order for you to get to heaven, you pay your tax and we'll get you to heaven. But now, many have compounded that belief by saying we are in an end time, and truly, some believe an end of the age appears to be close. It's in the daily news. It's affecting our politics. We're going to war over these concepts. But ancient cultures view time as cyclical. I mean, even the Old Testament speaks of a time and a season for every purpose. And this seems to be, to me, one of the reasons your work is so important, because this linear view, where's it leading us?
Yeah, and, the linear view is only about 150 years old. Really, it began with the work of probably Herbert Spencer and Darwin, who, were really studying biology. And because history was progressing at a rather rapid rate, I should say civilization, since the Dark Ages, it was sort of this biological theory was extrapolated outward to sort of all civilization, and I think that fitted sort of the political agendas of the